Chapter 5. A description of the temple. Now this temple, as I have already said, was built upon a strong hill. At first the plain at the top was hardly sufficient for the holy house and the altar, for the ground about it was very uneven, and like a precipice. But when King Solomon, who was that person that built the temple, had built a wall to it on its east side, there was then added one cloister founded on a bank cast up for it, and on the other parts the holy house stood naked. But in future ages the people added new banks, and the hill became a larger plain. They then broke down the wall on the north side and took in as much as sufficed afterward for the compass of the entire temple. And when they had built walls on 3 sides of the temple round about from the bottom of the hill, and had performed a work that was greater than could be hoped for, in which work long ages were spent by them, as well as all their sacred treasures were exhausted, which were still replenished by those tributes which were sent to God from the whole habitable earth. They then encompassed their upper courts with cloisters, as well as they did the lowest court of the temple. The lowest part of this was erected to the height of 300 cubits, and in some places more. Yet did not the entire depth of the foundations appear, for they brought earth and filled up the valleys, as being desirous to make them on a level with the narrow streets of the city, wherein they made use of stones of 40 cubits in magnitude. For the great plenty of money they then had, and the liberality of the people, made this attempt of theirs to succeed to an incredible degree. And what could not be hoped for as ever to be accomplished was, by perseverance and length of time, brought to perfection. Now for the works that were above these foundations, these were not unworthy of such foundations. For all the cloisters were double, and the pillars to them belonging were 25 cubits in height, and supported the cloisters. These pillars were of one entire stone each of them, and that stone was white marble, and the roofs were adorned with cedar, curiously graven. The natural magnificence and excellent polish, and the harmony of the joints in these cloisters, afforded a prospect that was very remarkable, nor was it on the outside adorned with any work of the painter or engraver. The cloisters were in breadth 30 cubits, while the entire compass of it was by measure 6 furlongs, including the Tower of Antonia. These entire courts that were exposed to the air were laid with stones of all sorts. When you go through these first cloisters unto the second court of the temple, there was a partition made of stone all round, whose height was 3 cubits. Its construction was very elegant. Upon it stood pillars, at equal distances from one another, declaring the purity of law, some in Greek and some in Roman letters, that no foreigner should go within that sanctuary, for that second court of the temple was called the sanctuary, and was ascended to by 14 steps from the first court. This court was 4 square, and had a wall about it peculiar to itself. The height of its buildings, although it were on the outside 40 cubits, was hidden by the steps, and on the inside that height was but 25 cubits, for it being built over against a higher part of the hill with steps, it was no further to be entirely discerned within, being covered by the hill itself. Beyond those 13 steps there was the distance of 10 cubits. This was all plain. Whence there were other steps, each of 5 cubits apiece, that led to the gates, which gates on the north and south sides were 8, and on each of those sides 4, and of necessity 2 on the east. For since there was a partition built for the women on that side, as the proper place wherein they were to worship, there was a necessity for a second gate for them. This gate was cut out of its wall, over against the first gate. There was also on the other sides 1 southern and 1 northern gate, through which was a passage into the court for the women. As to the other gates, the women were not allowed to pass through them, nor when they went through their own gate could they go beyond their own wall. This place was allotted to the women of our own country and of other countries, provided they were of that same nation, and that equally. The western part of this court had no gate at all, but the wall was built entire on that side. But then the cloisters which were betwixt the gates extended from the wall inward, before the chambers, for they were supported by very fine and large pillars. These cloisters were single, and excepting their magnitude, were no way inferior to those of the lower court. Now 9 of these gates were on every side covered over with gold and silver, as were the jambs of their doors and their lintels. But there was 1 gate that was without the holy house, which was of Corinthian brass, and greatly excelled those that were only covered with silver and gold. Each gate had 2 doors, whose height was severally 30 cubits, and their breadth 15. However, they had large spaces within of 30 cubits, and each had side rooms, for those, both in breadth and in length, built like towers, and their height was above 40 cubits. 2 pillars did also support these rooms, and were in circumference 12 cubits. Now the magnitudes of the other gates were equal to one another, but that over the Corinthian gate, which opened on the east over against the gate of the holy house itself, was much larger, for its height was 50 cubits, and its doors were 40 cubits, and it was adorned after a most costly manner, as having much richer and thicker plates of silver and gold upon them than the other. These gates had silver and gold poured upon them by Alexander, the father of Tiberius. Now there were 15 steps which led away from the wall of the court of the women to this greater gate, whereas those that led thither from the other gates were 5 steps shorter. As to the holy house itself, which was placed in the midst of the innermost court, that most sacred part of the temple, it was ascended to by 12 steps, and in front of its height and its breadth were equal, in each 100 cubits, though it was behind 40 cubits narrower. For on its front it had what may be styled shoulders on each side, that passed 20 cubits further. Its first gate was 70 cubits high, and 25 cubits broad, but this gate had no doors, for it represented the universal visibility of heaven, and that it cannot be excluded from any place. Its front was covered with gold all over, and through it the first part of the house, that was more inward, did all of it appear, which, as it was very large, so did all the parts about the more inward gate appear to shine to those that saw them. But then, as the entire house was divided into 2 parts within, it was only the first part of it that was open to our view. Its height extended all along to 90 cubits in height, and its length was 50 cubits, and its breadth 20. But that gate which was at this end of the first part of the house was, as we have already observed, all over covered with gold, as was its whole wall about it. It also had golden vines above it, from which clusters of grapes hung as tall as a man's height. But then this house, as it was divided into 2 parts, the inner part was lower than the appearance of the outer, and had golden doors of 55 cubits altitude, and 16 in breadth. But before these doors there was a veil of equal largeness with the doors. It was a Babylonian curtain, embroidered with blue and fine linen, and scarlet, and purple, and of a contexture that was truly wonderful. Nor was this mixture of colors without its mystical interpretation, but was a kind of image of the universe, for by the scarlet there seemed to be enigmatically signified fire, by the fine flax the earth, by the blue the air, and by the purple the sea, 2 of them having their colors the foundation of this resemblance. But the fine flax and the purple have their own origin for that foundation, the earth producing the one and the sea the other. This curtain also had embroidered upon it all that was mystical in the heavens, excepting that of the 12 signs, representing living creatures. When any persons entered into the temple, its floor received them. This part of the temple, therefore, was in height 60 cubits, and its length the same, whereas its breadth was but 20 cubits. But still that 60 cubits in length was divided again, and the first part of it was cut off at 40 cubits, and had in it 3 things that were very wonderful and famous among all mankind: the candlestick, the table of shewbread, and the altar of incense. Now the 7 lamps signified the 7 planets, for so many there were springing out of the candlestick. Now the 12 loaves that were upon the table signified the circle of the zodiac and the year, but the altar of incense, by its 13 kinds of sweet-smelling spices with which the sea replenished it, signified that God is the possessor of all things that are both in the uninhabitable and habitable parts of the earth, and that they are all to be dedicated to his use. But the innermost part of the temple of all was of 20 cubits. This was also separated from the outer part by a veil. In this there was nothing at all. It was inaccessible and inviolable, and not to be seen by any, and was called the Holy of Holies. Now about the sides of the lower part of the temple there were little houses, with passages out of one into another. There were a great many of them, and they were of 3 stories high. There were also entrances on each side into them from the gate of the temple. But the superior part of the temple had no such little houses any further, because the temple was there narrower, and 40 cubits higher, and of a smaller body than the lower parts of it. Thus we collect that whole height, including the 60 cubits from the floor, amounted to 100 cubits. Now the outward face of the temple in its front wanted nothing that was likely to surprise either men's minds or their eyes, for it was covered all over with plates of gold of great weight, and at the first rising of the sun reflected back a very fiery splendor, and made those who forced themselves to look upon it to turn their eyes away, just as they would have done at the sun's own rays. But this temple appeared to strangers, when they were coming to it at a great distance, like a mountain covered with snow. For as to those parts of it that were not gilt, they were exceedingly white. Upon its top it had spikes with sharp points, to prevent any pollution of it by birds sitting upon it. Of its stones, some of them were 45 cubits in length, 5 in height, and 6 in breadth. Before this temple stood the altar, 15 cubits high, and equal both in length and in breadth, each of which dimensions was 50 cubits. The figure it was built in was a square, and it had corners like horns, and the passage up to it was by an insensible acclivity. It was formed without any iron tool, nor did any such iron tool so much as touch it at any time. There was also a wall of partition, about a cubit in height, made of fine stones, and so as to be grateful to the sight. This encompassed the holy house and the altar, and kept the people that were on the outside off from the priests. Moreover, those that had the gonorrhea and the leprosy were excluded out of the city entirely. Women also, when their courses were upon them, were shut out of the temple, nor when they were free from that impurity were they allowed to go beyond the limit before mentioned. Men also, that were not thoroughly pure, were prohibited to come to the inner court of the temple. Nay, the priests themselves were not pure, were prohibited to come into it also. Now all of those of the stock of the priests that could not minister by reason of some defect in their bodies came within the partition, together with those that had no such imperfection, and had their share with them by reason of their stock, but still made use of none except their own private garments. For nobody but he that officiated had on his sacred garments. But then those priests that were without any blemish upon them went up to the altar clothed in fine linen. They abstained chiefly from wine, out of this fear, lest otherwise they should transgress some rules of their ministration. The high priest did also go up with them, not always indeed, but on the 7th days and new moons, and if any festivals belonging to our nation, which we celebrate every year, happened. When he officiated, he had on a pair of breeches that reached beneath his privy parts to his thighs, and had on an inner garment of linen, together with a blue garment, round, without seam, with fringe work, and reaching to the feet. There were also golden bells that hung upon the fringes, and pomegranates intermixed among them. The bells signified thunder, and pomegranates lightning. But that girdle that tied the garment to the breast was embroidered with 5 rows of various colors, of gold and purple and scarlet, and also of fine linen and blue, with which colors we told you before the veils of the temple were embroidered also. And the like embroidery was upon the ephod, but the quantity of gold therein was greater. Its figure was that of a stomacher for the breast. There were upon it 2 golden buttons like small shields, which buttoned the ephod to the garment. In these buttons were enclosed 2 very large and very excellent sardonyxes, having the names of the tribes of that nation engraved upon them. On the other part were hung 12 stones, 3 in a row one way, 4 in the other, a sardius, a topaz, an emerald, a carbuncle, a jasper, and a sapphire, an agate, an amethyst, and a ligure, an onyx, a beryl, and a chrysolite, upon every one of which was again engraved one of the aforementioned names of the tribes. A mitre also of fine linen encompassed his head, which was tied by a blue ribbon, about which there was another golden crown, in which was engraven the sacred name of God. It consists of 4 vowels. However, the high priest did not wear these garments at other times, but a more plain habit. He only did it when he went into the most sacred part of the temple, which he did but once a year, on that day when our custom is for all of us to keep a fast to God. And thus much concerning the city and the temple, but for the customs and laws hereto relating, we shall speak more accurately another time. For there remain a great many things thereto relating which have not been here touched upon. Now as to the tower of Antonia, it was situated at the corner of 2 cloisters of the court of the temple, of that on the west and that on the north. It was erected upon a rock of 50 cubits in height, and was on a great precipice. It was the work of King Herod, wherein he demonstrated his natural magnanimity. In the first place, the rock itself was covered over with smooth pieces of stone from its foundation, both for ornament and that any one who would either try to get up or go down it might not be able to hold his feet upon it. Next to this, and before you come to the edifice of the tower itself, there was a wall 3 cubits high, but within that wall all the space of the tower of Antonia itself was built upon, to the height of 40 cubits. The inward parts had the largeness and form of a palace, it being parted into all kinds of rooms and other conveniences, such as courts and places for bathing, and broad spaces for camps, insomuch that by having all conveniences that cities wanted, it might seem to be composed of several cities, but by its magnificence it seemed a palace. And as the entire structure resembled that of a tower, it contained also 4 other distinct towers at its 4 corners, whereof the others were but 50 cubits high, whereas that which lay upon the southeast corner was 70 cubits high, that from thence the whole temple might be viewed. But on the corner where it joined the 2 cloisters of the temple, it had passages down to them both, through which the guard, for there was always lay in this tower a Roman legion, went several ways among the cloisters with their arms on the Jewish festivals, in order to watch the people, that they might not there attempt to make any innovations. For the temple was a fortress that guarded the city, as was the tower of Antonia a guard to the temple, and in that tower were the guards of those 3. There was also a peculiar fortress belonging to the upper city, which was Herod's palace. But for the hill Bezetha, it was divided from the tower Antonia, as we have already told you. And as that hill on which the tower of Antonia stood was the highest of these 3, so it did adjoin to the new city, and was the only place that hindered the sight of the temple on the north. And this shall suffice at present to have been spoken about the city and the walls about it, because I have proposed to myself to make a more accurate description of it elsewhere. Chapter 6, concerning the tyrants Simon and John, how also as Titus was going round the wall of the city, Nicanor was wounded by a dart, which accident provoked Titus to press on the siege. Now the warlike men that were in the city, and the multitude of the seditious that were with Simon, were 10,000, besides the Idumeans. Those 10,000 had 50 commanders, over whom this Simon was supreme. The Idumeans that paid him homage were 5,000, and had 8 commanders, among whom those of greatest fame were Jacob the son of Sosas, and Simon the son of Cathlas. Jotre, who had seized upon the temple, had 6,000 armed men under 20 commanders. The zealots also that had come over to him, and left off their opposition, were 2,400, and had the same commander that they had formerly, Eleazar, together with Simon the son of Aranus. Now while these factions fought one against another, the people were their prey on both sides, as we have said already, and that part of the people who would not join with them in their wicked practices were plundered by both factions. Simon held the upper city, and the great wall as far as Cedron, and as much of the old wall as bent from Siloam to the east, and which went down to the palace of Monobazus, who was king of the Adiabeni, beyond Euphrates. He also held that fountain, and the Acra, which was no other than the lower city. He also held all that reached to the palace of Queen Helena, the mother of Monobazus. But John held the temple, and the parts thereto adjoining, for a great way, as also Ophla, and the valley called the Valley of Cedron. When the parts that were interposed between their possessions were burnt by them, they left a space wherein they might fight with each other. For this internal sedition did not cease, even when the Romans were encamped near their very wall. But although they had grown wiser at the first onset the Romans made upon them, this lasted but a while, for they returned to their former madness, and separated one from another, and fought it out, and did everything that the besiegers could desire them to do. For they never suffered anything that was worse from the Romans than they made each other suffer, nor was there any misery endured by the city after these men's actions that could be esteemed new. But it was most of all unhappy before it was overthrown, while those that took it did it a greater kindness, for I venture to affirm that the sedition destroyed the city, and the Romans destroyed the sedition, which it was a much harder thing to do than to destroy the walls, so that we may justly ascribe our misfortunes to our own people, and the just vengeance taken on them to the Romans, as to which matter let every one determine by the actions on both sides. Now when the affairs of the city were in this posture, Titus went round the city on the outside with some chosen horsemen, and looked about for a proper place where he might make an impression upon the walls. But as he was in doubt where he could possibly make an attack on any side, for the place was no way accessible where the valleys were, and on the other side the first wall appeared too strong to be shaken by the engines, he thereupon thought it best to make his assault upon the monument of John the high priest, for there it was that the first fortification was lower, and the second was not joined to it, the builders neglecting to build strong where the new city was not much inhabited. Here also was an easy passage to the third wall, through which he thought to take the upper city, and through the tower of Antonia, the temple itself. But at this time, as he was going round about the city, one of his friends, whose name was Nicanor, was wounded with a dart on his left shoulder, as he approached, together with Josephus, too near the wall, and attempted to discourse to those who were upon the wall about terms of peace, for he was a person known by them. On this account it was that Caesar, as soon as he knew of their vehemence, that they would not hear even such as approached them to persuade them to what tended to their own preservation, was provoked to press on the siege. He also at the same time gave his soldiers leave to set the suburbs on fire, and ordered that they should bring timber together, and raise banks against the city. And when he had parted his army into 3 parts in order to set about those works, he placed upon those that shot darts and the archers in the midst of the banks that were then raising, before whom he placed those engines that threw javelins, and darts and stones, that he might prevent the enemy from sallying out upon their works, and might hinder those that were upon the wall from being able to obstruct them. So the trees were now cut down immediately, and the suburbs left naked. But now, while the timber was carrying to raise the banks, and the whole army was earnestly engaged in their works, the Jews were not, however, quiet. And it happened that the people of Jerusalem, who had been hitherto plundered and murdered, were now of good courage, and supposed they should have a breathing time, while the others were very busy in opposing their enemies without the city, that they should now be avenged on those that had been the authors of their miseries, in case the Romans did but get the victory. However, John stayed behind out of his fear of Simon, even while his own men were earnest in making a sally upon their enemies without. Yet did not Simon lie still, for he lay near the place of the siege. He brought his engines of war, and disposed of them at due distances upon the wall, both those which they took from Cestius formerly, and those which they got when they seized the garrison that lay in the tower of Antonia. But though they had those engines in their possession, they had so little skill in using them that they were in great measure useless to them. But a few there were who had been taught by deserters how to use them, which they did use, though after an awkward manner. So they cast stones and arrows at those that were making the banks. They also ran out upon them by companies and fought with them. Now those that were at work covered themselves with hurdles, spread over their banks, and their engines were opposed to them when they made their excursions. The engines that all the legions had ready prepared for them were admirably contrived, but still more extraordinary ones belonged to the 10th Legion. Those that threw darts and those that threw stones were more forcible and larger than the rest, by which they not only repelled the excursions of the Jews, but drove those away that were upon the walls also. Now the stones that were cast were of the weight of a talent, and were carried 2 furlongs and further. The blow they gave was no way to be sustained, not only by those that stood first in the way, but by those that were beyond them for a great space. As for the Jews, they at first watched the coming of the stone, for it was of a white color, and could therefore not only be perceived by the great noise it made, but could be seen also before it came by its brightness. Accordingly, the watchmen that sat upon the towers gave them notice when the engine was let go, and the stone came from it, and cried out aloud, in their own country language, "The stone cometh." So those that were in its way stood off, and threw themselves down upon the ground, by which means, and by their thus guarding themselves, the stone fell down and did them no harm. But the Romans contrived how to prevent that by blacking the stone, who would then aim them with success, when the stone was not discerned beforehand, as it had been till then. So they destroyed many of them at one blow. Yet did not the Jews, under all this distress, permit the Romans to raise their banks in quiet, but they shrewdly and boldly exerted themselves, and repelled them both by night and by day. And now, upon the finishing the Roman works, the workmen measured the distance there was from the wall, and by lead in a line, which they threw to it from their banks, for they could not measure it any other wise, because the Jews would shoot at them, if they came to measure it themselves. And when they did found that the engines could reach the wall, they brought them thither. Then did Titus set his engines at proper distances so much nearer to the wall, that the Jews might not be able to repel them, and gave orders they should go to work. And when thereupon a prodigious noise echoed round about from 3 places, that on a sudden there was a great noise made by the citizens that were within the city, and no less a terror fell upon the seditious themselves, whereupon both sorts, seeing the common danger they were in, contrived to make a like defense. For those of different factions cried out to one another, and they acted entirely as in concert with their enemies, whereas they ought, however, notwithstanding God did not grant them a lasting concord in their present circumstances, to lay aside their enmities one against the other, and to unite together against the Romans. Accordingly, Simon gave those that came from the temple leave by proclamation to go upon the wall. John also himself, although he could not believe Simon was in earnest, gave them the same leave. So on both sides they laid aside their hatred and their peculiar quarrels, and formed themselves into one body. They then ran round the walls, and having a vast number of torches with them, they threw them at the machines, and shot darts perpetually upon those that impelled those engines which battered the wall. Nay, the bolder sort leapt out by troops upon the hurdles that covered the machines, and pulled them to pieces, and fell upon those that belonged to them, and beat them, not so much by any skill they had, as principally by the boldness of their attacks. However, Titus himself still sent assistance to those that were the hardest set, and placed on both horsemen and archers on the several sides of the engines, and thereby beat off those that brought the fire to them. He also thereby repelled those that shot stones or darts from the towers, and then set the engines to work in good earnest. Yet did not the wall yield to these blows, excepting where the battering ram of the 15th Legion moved to the corner of a tower, while the wall itself continued unhurt. For the wall was not presently in the same danger with the tower, which was extant far above it. Nor could the fall of that part of the tower easily break down any part of the wall itself together with it. Now the Jews intermitted their sallies for a while, but when they observed the Romans dispersed all abroad at their works and in their several camps, for they thought the Jews had retired out of weariness and fear, they all at once made a sally at the tower Hippicus through an obscure gate, and at the same time brought fire to burn the works, and went boldly up to the Romans, to their very fortifications themselves, where at the cry they made, those that were near them came presently to their assistance, and those farther off came running after them. And here the boldness of the Jews was too hard for the good order of the Romans, and as they beat those whom they first fell upon, so they pressed upon those that were now gotten together. So this fight about the machines was very hot, while on one side tried hard to set them on fire, and the other side to prevent it. On both sides there was a confused cry made, and many of those in the forefront of the battle were slain. However, the Jews were now too hard for the Romans, by the furious assaults they made like madmen, and the fire caught hold of the works, both of those works, and the engines themselves had been in danger of being burnt, had not many of these select soldiers that came from Alexandria opposed them to prevent it, and had they not behaved themselves with greater courage than they themselves supposed they could have done. For they outdid those in this fight that had greater reputations than themselves before. This was the state of things till Caesar took the stoutest of his horsemen and attacked the enemy, while he himself slew 12 of those that were in the forefront of the Jews, which death of these men, when the rest of the multitude saw, they gave way, and he pursued them, and drove them all into the city, and saved the works from the fire. Now it happened at this fight that a certain Jew was taken alive, who by Titus's order was crucified before the wall, to see whether the rest of them would be affrighted, and abate their obstinacy. But after the Jews were retired, John, who was commander of the Idumeans, was talking to a certain soldier of his acquaintance before the wall, was wounded by a dart shot at him by an Arabian, and died immediately, leaving the greatest lamentation to the Jews and sorrow to the seditious. For he was a man of great eminence, both for his actions and his conduct also. Chapter 7. How one of the towers erected by the Romans fell down of its own accord, and how the Romans after great slaughter had been made got possession of the first wall, and how also Titus made his assaults upon the second wall, as also concerning Longinus the Roman and Castor the Jew. Now on the next night a surprising disturbance fell upon the Romans, for whereas Titus had given orders for the erection of 3 towers of 50 cubits high, and that by setting men upon them at every bank, he might from thence drive those away who were upon the wall, it so happened that one of these towers fell down about midnight, and as its fall made a very great noise, fear fell upon the army, and they, supposing that the enemy was coming to attack them, ran all to their arms. Whereupon a disturbance and a tumult arose among the legions, and as nobody could tell what had happened, they went on after a disconsolate manner, and seeing no enemy appear, they were afraid of one of another, and every one demanded of his neighbor the watchword with great earnestness, as though the Jews had invaded their camp. And now were they like people under a panic fear, till Titus was informed of what happened and gave orders that all should be acquainted with it. And then, though with some difficulty, they got clear of the disturbance they had been under. Now these towers were very troublesome to the Jews, who otherwise opposed the Romans very courageously, for they shot at them out of their lighter engines from those towers, as they did also by those that threw darts, and the archers, and those that flung stones. For neither could the Jews reach those that were over them, by reason of their height, and it was not practicable to take them, nor to overturn them. They were so heavy, nor to set them on fire, because they were covered with plates of iron. So they retired out of the reach of the darts, and did no longer endeavor to hinder the impression of their rams, which by continually beating upon the wall did gradually prevail against it, so that the wall already gave way to the Nico, for by that name did the Jews themselves call the greatest of their engines, because it conquered all things. And now they were for a long while grown weary of fighting and of keeping guards, and were retired to lodge in the night time at a distance from the wall. It was on other accounts also thought by them to be superfluous to guard the wall, there being besides that 2 other fortifications still remaining, and they being slothful, and their counsels having been ill concerted on all occasions, so a great many grew lazy and retired. Then the Romans mounted the breach where Nico had made one, and all the Jews left guarding that wall, and retreated to the second wall. So those that had gotten over the wall opened the gates, and received all the army within it. And thus did the Romans get possession of this first wall, on the 15th day of the siege, which was the 7th day of the month of Artemisius, or Gr, when they demolished a great part of it, as well as they did the northern parts of the city, which had been demolished also by Cestius formerly. And now Titus pitched his camp within the city, at that place which was called the camp of the Assyrians, having seized upon all that lay as far as Cedron, but took care to be out of reach of the Jews' darts. He then presently began his attacks, upon which the Jews divided themselves into several bodies, and courageously defended that wall, while John and his faction did it from the tower of Antonia, and from the northern cloister of the temple, and fought the Romans before the monuments of King Alexander. And Cireo's army also took for their share the spot of ground that was near John's monument, and fortified it as far as that gate, where water was brought into the tower of Hippicus. However, the Jews made violent sallies, and that frequently also, and in bodies together out of the gates, and there fought the Romans. And when they were pursued all together to the wall, they were beaten in those fights, as wanting the skill of the Romans. But when they fought them from the walls, they were too hard for them, the Romans being encouraged by their power, and joined to their skill, as were the Jews by their boldness, which was nourished by the fear they were in, and that hardness which is natural to our nation under calamities. They were also encouraged still by the hope of deliverance, as were the Romans by their hopes of subduing them in a little time. Nor did either side grow weary, but attacks and writings upon the wall, and perpetual sallies out in bodies, were there all day long. Nor were there any sort of warlike engagements that were not then put in use. And the night itself had much ado to part them, when they began to fight in the morning. Nay, the night itself was passed without sleep on both sides, and was more uneasy than the day to them, while one was afraid lest the wall should be taken, and the other lest the Jews should make sallies upon their camps. Both sides also lay in their armor during the night time, and thereby were ready at the first appearance of light to go to the battle. Now among the Jews the ambition was who should undergo the first dangers, and thereby gratify their commanders. Above all, they had a great veneration and dread of Simon, and to that degree he was regarded by every one of those that were under him, that at his command they were very ready to kill themselves with their own hands. What made the Romans so courageous was their usual custom of conquering and disuse of being defeated, their constant wars and perpetual warlike exercises, and the grandeur of their dominion. And what was now their chief encouragement, Titus, who was present everywhere with them all, for it appeared a terrible thing to grow weary while Caesar was there, and fought bravely as well as they did, and was himself at once an eyewitness of such as behaved themselves valiantly, and he who was to reward them also. He was besides esteemed an advantage to present, at present to have any one's valor known by Caesar, on which account many of them appeared to have more alacrity than strength to answer it. And now, as the Jews were about this time standing in array before the wall, and that in a strong body, and while both parties were throwing their darts at each other, Longinus, one of the equestrian order, leapt out of the army of the Romans and leapt into the very midst of the army of the Jews. And as they dispersed themselves upon the attack, he slew 2 of their men of the greatest courage. One of them he struck in his mouth as he was coming to meet him. The other was slain by him by that very dart which he drew out of the body of the other, with which he ran this man through his side as he was running away from him. And when he had done this, he first ran out of the midst of his enemies to his own side. So this man signalized himself for his valor, and many there were who were ambitious of gaining the like reputation. And now the Jews were unconcerned at what they had suffered themselves from the Romans, and were only solicitous about what mischief they could do to them. And death itself seemed a small matter to them, if at the same time they could kill any one of their enemies. But Titus took care to secure his own soldiers from harm, as well as to have them overcome their enemies. He also said that inconsiderate violence was madness, and that this alone was the true courage that was joined with good conduct. He therefore commanded his men to take care, when they fought their enemies, that they received no harm from them at the same time, and thereby show themselves to be truly valiant men. And now Titus brought one of his engines to the middle tower of the north part of the wall, in which a certain crafty Jew, whose name was Castor, lay in ambush, with 10 others like himself, the rest being fled away by reason of the archers. These men lay still for a while, as in great fear under their breastplates. But when the tower was shaken, they arose, and Castor did then stretch out his hand as a petitioner, and called for Caesar, and by his voice moved his compassion, and begged of him to have mercy upon them. And Titus, in the innocency of his heart, believing him to be in earnest, and hoping that the Jews did now repent, stopped the working of the battering ram, and forbade them to shoot at the petitioners, and bid Castor say what he had a mind to say to him. He said he would come down if he would give him his right hand for his security, to which Titus replied that he was well pleased with his such agreeable conduct, and would be very well pleased if all the Jews would be of his mind, and that he was ready to give the like security to the city. Now 5 of the 10 dissembled with him, and pretended to beg for mercy, while the rest cried aloud that they would never be slaves to the Romans, while it was in their power to die in a state of freedom. Now while these men were quarreling for a long while, the attack was delayed. Castor also sent to Simon, and told him that they might take some time for consultation about what was to be done, because he would elude the power of the Romans for a considerable time. And at the same time that he sent thus to him, he appeared openly to exhort those that were obstinate to accept Titus's hand for their security. But they seemed very angry at it, and brandished their naked swords upon the breastworks, and struck themselves upon their breast, and fell down as if they had been slain. Hereupon Titus, and those with him, were amazed at the courage of the men, and as they were not able to exactly see what was done, they admired their great fortitude, and pitied their calamity. During this interval, a certain person shot a dart at Castor, and wounded him in his nose, whereupon he presently pulled out the dart, and showed it to Titus, and complained that this was unfair treatment. So Caesar reproved him that shot the dart, and sent Josephus, who then stood by him, to give his right hand to Castor. But Josephus said that he would not go to him, because these pretended petitioners meant nothing that was good. He also restrained those friends of his who were zealous to go to him. But still there was one Aeneas, a deserter, who said that he would go to him. Castor also called to them, that somebody should come and receive the money which he had with him. This made Aeneas more earnestly to run to him with his bosom open. Then did Castor take up a great stone and threw it at him, which missed him, because he guarded himself against it. But still it wounded another soldier that was joining to him. When Caesar understood that this was a delusion, he perceived that mercy in war is a pernicious thing, because such cunning tricks have less place under the exercise of greater severity. So he caused the engine to work more strongly than before on account of his anger at the deceit put upon him. But Castor and his companion set the tower on fire when it began to give way, and leapt through the flame into a hidden vault that was under it, which made the Romans further suppose that they were men of great courage, as having cast themselves into the fire. Chapter 8. How the Romans took the second wall twice, and got all ready for taking the third wall. Now Caesar took this wall there on the 5th day after he had taken the first, and when the Jews had fled from him, he entered into it with 1,000 armed men, and those of his choice troops, and this at a place where there were the merchants of wool, the braziers, and the market for cloth, and where the narrow streets led obliquely to the wall. Wherefore, if Titus had either demolished a larger part of the wall immediately, or had come in, and according to the law of war, had laid waste to what was left, his victory would not, I suppose, have been mixed with any loss to himself. But now, out of the hope that he had, that he should make the Jews ashamed of their obstinacy, by not being willing, when he was able, to afflict them more than he needed to do, he did not widen the breach of the wall, in order to make a safer retreat upon occasion. For he did not think they would lay snares for him that did them such a kindness. When therefore he came in, he did not permit his soldiers to kill any of those they caught, nor to set fire to their houses, neither. Nay, he gave leave to the seditious, if they had a mind, to fight without any harm to the people, and promised to restore the people's effects to them. For he was very desirous to preserve the city for his own sake, and the temple for the sake of the city. As to the people, he had them for a long time ready to comply with his proposals. But as to the fighting men, this humanity of his seemed a mark of his weakness, and they imagined that he had made these proposals because he was not able to take the rest of the city. They also threatened death to the people, if they should any one of them say a word about a surrender. They moreover cut their throats of such as talked of a peace, and then attacked those Romans that were come within the wall. Some of them they met in the narrow streets, and some they fought against from their houses, while they made a sudden sally out upon the upper gates, and assaulted such Romans as were beyond the wall, till those that guarded the wall were so affrighted that they leapt down from their towers, and retired to their several camps, upon which a great noise was made by the Romans that were within, because they were encompassed round on every side by their enemies, as also by them that were without, because they were in fear for those that were left in the city. Thus did the Jews grow more numerous perpetually, and had great advantages over the Romans, by their full knowledge of those narrow lanes. And they wounded a great many of them, and fell upon them, and drove them out of the city. Now these Romans were at present forced to make the best resistance they could, for they were not able in great numbers to get out of the breach of the wall. It was so narrow. It is also probable that all those that were gotten within had been cut to pieces, if Titus had not sent them succors, for he ordered the archers to stand at the upper ends of these narrow lakes, and he stood himself where the greatest multitude of his enemies was, and with his darts he put a stop to them, as with him did Domitius Sabinus also, a valiant man, and one that in this battle appeared so to be. Thus did Caesar continue to shoot darts at the Jews continually, and to hinder them from coming up upon his men, and this until all his soldiers had retreated out of the city. And thus were the Romans driven out, after they had possessed themselves of the second wall. Whereupon the fighting men that were in the city were lifted up in their minds, and were elevated upon this their good success, and began to think that the Romans would never venture to come into the city any more, and that if they kept within it themselves, they should not be any more conquered. For God had blinded their minds for the transgressions they had been guilty of, nor could they see how much greater forces the Romans had than those that were now expelled, no more than they could discern how a famine was creeping upon them. For hitherto they had fed themselves out of the public miseries, and drank the blood of the city. But now poverty had for a long time seized upon the better part, and a great many had died already for want of necessaries, although the seditious indeed supposed the destruction of the people to be an easement to themselves, for they desired that none others might be preserved, but such were against a peace with the Romans, and were resolved to live in opposition to them. And they were pleased when the multitude of those of a contrary opinion were consumed, as being then freed from a heavy burden. And this was their disposition of mind with regard to those that were within the city, while they covered themselves with their armor, and prevented the Romans when they were trying to get into the city again, and made a wall of their own bodies over against that part of the wall that was cast down. Thus they did valiantly defend themselves for 3 days. But on the 4th day they could not support themselves against the vehement assaults of Titus, but were compelled by force to fly whither they had fled before. So he quietly possessed himself again of that wall, and demolished it entirely. And when he had put a garrison into the towers that were on the south parts of the city, he contrived how he might assault the third wall.